Roots of the oak in a suburban town where the skies were perpetually blue and the houses looked like replicas of each other. Tasha Collins and her family had found their slice of peace. The town, nestled in a quiet corner of Middle America, was everything Tasha had dreamed of until she realized that her skin color made her stand out like a lone flower in a sea of white daisies. Tasha and her husband, Marcus, had moved into their home in the Maple Ridge neighborhood 5 years ago. Drawn by the promise of good schools for their 2 children, Jordan and Amara, and the quiet suburban life that seemed so far removed from the chaos they had left behind in the city. They had worked hard for everything they had: the house, the cars, the well-kept lawn, and had come to love their peaceful street. But there were shadows in the community, and no one had warned them about them. The Callahans, the family that lived next door, were the kind of people who gave Tasha a bad feeling from the start. On the surface, they seemed pleasant enough, Carol and Steve, with their 2 kids, Brittany and Jake. Steve worked as an insurance agent, and Carol volunteered at the local school. They always wore perfect smiles and waved hello when they passed by. But Tasha had learned to trust her instincts. Something wasn't right. It wasn't the obvious signs: the for sale sign that had gone up in their front yard last year, and then mysteriously disappeared. Or the way Carol's voice had sharpened when Tasha had invited her over for a cup of coffee. It was the little things: the way the Callahans never came out on the block when Tasha and her family were outside. The whispered conversations at the edge of the fence when Tasha's children played in the yard. The looks, cold and sharp, when Tasha's family gathered on their porch in the evening, laughing and talking. And then there were the things she couldn't see, the subtle daggers of racism that punctuated their every interaction. It started small, of course. At first, it was just a few passive-aggressive comments, like when Carol commented on how growing up in the city must have been so different for Tasha, as if her life in the city was something to be pitied. Or when Steve casually asked Marcus if his job at the car dealership was a good one. But slowly, those comments became sharper, more pointed, like knives cutting deeper into Tasha's heart. She tried to brush it off, tried to tell herself that maybe she was overthinking things. After all, they were neighbors. They were supposed to be friendly. But the tension never seemed to lift. It came to a head one summer evening when Amara and Jordan were playing in the front yard. The kids had a small inflatable pool, and Amara was laughing, splashing water at her brother, her dark skin glistening in the sunlight. It was a peaceful moment, the kind of moment that made Tasha grateful for the life they had built. But peace was fragile, and the Callahans were about to shatter it. Steve Callahan came storming out of his house, his face red with anger. "You need to control your kids," he shouted, his voice rising with every word. "They're being too loud. The entire block can hear them." Tasha looked up, her jaw clenching. She had heard Steve's complaints before, but this was different. He was looking. "He was looking for a fight. Their kids, Steve," she said calmly. "They're having fun. There's nothing wrong with that." Steve's eyes narrowed. "That's the problem," he spat. "It's always too much. Too loud. Too much. People like you think you can do whatever you want. You're not even supposed to be here." Tasha froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let her fear show. She had heard these words before. This was the mask slipping, no longer the thin veil of civility. It was the ugly truth that lurked beneath. "Get off my property, Steve," Tasha said, her voice low and steady. "You don't get to talk to my children like that. And you don't get to tell me what I can or can't do on my own land." The rage in Steve's eyes flared, and before Tasha could blink, he was in her face, his finger jabbing toward her chest. "You think you're better than us, huh? Just because you bought a house here doesn't mean you belong." Tasha felt the anger rise in her chest, but she kept it in check. She couldn't afford to let him see her break. Her children were watching, and she would never let them see her cower. I belong here, because I've worked for everything I have, she said, her voice now a firm declaration. And I'll fight for my family and my home. You've crossed a line, Steve. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to Amara, who had been standing quietly by the pool, and said something that made Tasha's blood run cold. You should go back to where you came from, Steve sneered. You're not welcome here at that moment. Something inside Tasha snapped her mind, replayed every moment of tension, every quiet insult, every time she had been forced to swallow her pride and let things slide. She had protected her family, swallowed the bitterness, and kept her head down for too long. But she wasn't going to let her children see her bow down to hatred. Tasha stepped forward, her chest rising and falling with each breath. You don't get to tell me or my kids where we belong, she said, her voice now firm and unshakable. You're the one who doesn't belong here. This is my home, and I will protect my family from you, no matter what it takes. Steve's eyes widened in disbelief. No one had ever talked back to him like this before. He was used to people cowering, backing down when confronted. But Tasha wasn't like the others. Get out of my face, Steve, she said, pushing him back with one firm hand. Or I'll make you for a moment. The world seemed to freeze. The other neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, hesitated. No one wanted to get involved. It was easier to pretend it wasn't happening. But then something remarkable happened. Karen, a woman who had always kept to herself, stepped out from her porch and approached Tasha Steve. That's enough, Karen said firmly. You need to apologize to her and her family. You've been bullying them for too long. Steve's face turned purple with rage. But the words wouldn't come. The other neighbors' whispers of support, now growing louder, began to step forward too. The silence that had held them all captive for years began to crack. Steve and Carol, their faces pale with fury and fear, turned on their heels and marched back into their house, slamming the door behind them. The neighbors, once silent, now stood tall, their voices rising in unity. Tasha turned back to her children, at her with wide eyes. She smiled, a smile that was both fierce and loving. We're stronger than hate, she said softly, and from that day forward, they were no longer the quiet bullies of the neighborhood. They were the outcasts, the ones who had shown their true colors. And the neighborhood, for the first time, began to change. In the weeks that followed, the Callahans slowly isolated themselves. The community, which had once been passive, began to come together in ways that Tasha had never imagined. The neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid to challenge the status quo, began to stand up. Tasha and her family became the cornerstone of that change. They no longer had to hide in the shadows of their own lives. They were proud, unapologetic, and unbroken. Tasha stood tall every day, knowing that she had fought not just for her family, but for something bigger. She had fought for justice, for equality, and for the future of her children. And in the end, the strength of her spirit had brought about a transformation in their small town, a transformation that would outlast even the harshest storms. Because, like the oak tree planted in the yard of their home, her roots ran deep, and no amount of hate could ever uproot them. And